Musical and linguistic negotiations in a Balinese music learning context. In 2010, Gettysburg College purchased a gamelan, an ensemble comprised mainly of metallic barred instruments, cymbals, gongs, and drums. This purchase was part of a new strategic plan for music education at the newly established Sunderman Conservatory of Music that would draw from approaches in music education and ethnomusicology to develop new forms of musicianship at the college. This vision extended the work Dr. Brent C. Talbot had done the previous year, teaching at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and conducting research for his dissertation in the three settings comprising Gamelan Eka Shruti Alainai in the Robert E. Brown Center for World Music. While at Illinois, he worked with the celebrated Balinese gamelan composer and teacher, Iketut Gede Snawa, to incorporate gamelan into two classes in music education, orientations to teaching music K-12 and teaching secondary general music. During this experience, he observed that when the pre-service music teachers in his classes engaged with a musical practice that was different from their own, they were better equipped to imagine new possibilities for how music could be understood, experienced, learned, and taught in their future classrooms. Talbot found this process empowering for the pre-service teachers. Eager to capitalize on this observation, he embarked on developing a curriculum in music teacher education here at Gettysburg College that uses gamelan and other tools to critically examine traditional notions of music teaching and learning in the United States, to blur boundaries between musics, ways of knowing music, and spaces where musicking takes place, and to reveal how discursive sources of power, dominance, inequality, and bias are initiated, perpetuated, reproduced, and transformed within settings of music transmission. Gamelan Gita Semara, Beautiful Sound, here at Gettysburg College, is a Balinese gamelan angklung that was purchased through the assistance of Iketut Gede Snawa. This kind of ensemble is one of more than 25 distinct types found on the island of Bali. Since the 13th century, gamelan angklung has been played for ceremonial and ritual functions, such as tooth filing ceremonies and cremations associated with the type of Hindu religion practiced on the island. In the 20th and 21st centuries, newer styles of composition have transferred from larger, more modern gamelan styles. Outside of Indonesia, gamelan ensembles have primarily been applied to teaching ethnomusicology in higher education institutions, as well as in community music projects. Research surrounding gamelan has shown that the use of gamelan music can lead to greater cross-cultural understanding. Gamelan at Gettysburg College, as at other institutions of higher education, is used for such purposes. Watson and Dunbar Hall and McIntosh investigated the value individuals attach to musical identities they construct during participation in gamelan. MacDonald and Meal explored the use of gamelan music as a tool employed in various socio-therapeutic and educational settings. Bakken et al. Investigated the health and well-being benefits of incorporating gamelan music into a program for children with autism. McIntosh used gamelan with developing empathy among tutors who work with teaching adult literacy education. Learned mostly without notation through an oral tradition, gamelan requires players to work together to learn the techniques for how to play the interlocking music. As in Bali, the instruments at Gettysburg College are stored in a shared space together, and it is not culturally appropriate to separate them or take them out of the space for individual practice. Thus, the instruments themselves bring another layer of community participation, as members must come together to this space to practice or rehearse. As in Bali, gamelan at Gettysburg College has become a community effort. Members include Gettysburg College students, faculty, and staff, as well as members from the surrounding community. The ensemble is a not-for-credit, non-graded, non-load-bearing, free group that rehearses in the music education classroom on campus or outside on the campus quad on Friday afternoons, with the critical mass of people arriving between 1:30 and 3 p.m. The flexibility of time is one that is similar to Balinese culture and provides an antithesis to the centering nature of a registered credit-bearing class found in Western institutions of higher education. New members often struggle at first with this flexibility, but soon embrace it. One member noted that it is a stress-free space where each person can come to get something unique out of the experience. Each semester my schedule changes, but I've always found a way to participate, Whether by coming a bit early or staying a little late, we always make it work. With nothing to hold over their heads like grades or registration, Talbot has found that members come because they are motivated to be there and end up taking full ownership over their learning in a way that is not commonly found in other music classes and ensembles at Gettysburg. The ensemble took off in its first year, and Talbot had done everything he could to make it feel like his experiences in Bali. But even with all of the success of the ensemble, he found that it felt dramatically different from what had been done in any of his previous experience. And it took him a while to realize that that was because he wasn't Balinese. Having played in gamelans extensively and having lived in Bali over 2 summers, Talbot did his best at representing the cultural ideas and practices of the ensemble, but the very nature of not being Balinese, not being Hindu, not having grown up with the music, and not having others in our program who had experienced what he had experienced, was blocking the learning. So Talbot called his friend Pakasnawa and wrote a grant to bring him and his family to Gettysburg to do a 10-day residency. After the Asnawas left, it did feel a little different and a little closer to Talbot's previous experiences, and this was because some of the participants in the ensemble began to take on new roles, began leading the ensemble, and teaching others the parts they could remember. The model of transmission had evolved. After Asnawa came, Talbot began coordinating artist-in-residency programs in the local elementary and secondary schools throughout central Pennsylvania. These interactive workshops bring the instruments to schools, where members of the ensemble and pre-service music teachers in methods courses gain experience teaching a music from outside the Western tradition. While engaging in various schools around Adams County, Talbot also observed how pre-service music teachers interacted with students whose primary language was not English. Talbot noted that pre-service music teachers and many of the adults in the surrounding schools approached English language learners from a position of authority, where the knowledge of one who comes from the dominant culture and speaks one language holds more value over those who negotiate more than one language and culture. Using these observations, Talbot created a course that would place pre-service music teachers in a position of becoming an other, and of experiencing what it would be like to struggle as a language learner. This course brought students to Bali to experience what it was like to be taught music by instructors whose primary language is not English, and to observe how teachers in a cross-cultural context negotiate cultural identities and language when working with people outside of their own culture, and to have students reflect on how they have to negotiate their own cultural identities and language when learning in this environment. This course would encourage participants to reflect upon their learning processes to help them become more empathetic with some of the difficulties faced by language learners. When Dr. Talbot first introduced his idea for this course to his students, I had been in the Gamelan ensemble for 1 year and had participated in the residency with Pakasnawa, as well as having extensively discussed Dr. Talbot's research with him. So, needless to say, I was excited about the opportunity and possibility of continuing to learn Gamelan from Balinese teachers in Gamelan's original context of Bali. In addition to this excitement, this trip served 2 purposes for me. The course was being offered fulfilled the English language learners requirement I had not yet taken for my degree. And as much as I wanting to go does not get you halfway across the world. The cost was about $4,000 per student to fund the trip, and I could not afford that. So I began looking into options for funding, and I applied for a Mellon grant from the college to conduct undergraduate research while abroad, asking Dr. Talbot to be my mentor through that process. We then developed a study surrounding the course and looked at how meaning is constructed in cross-cultural learning environments. For our study, we collected audio and video rehearsal recordings, as well as developed interview questions for a series of 3 semi-structured interviews we conducted with each student throughout the trip. These are examples of the questions we asked in the first interview. If you look at question 2, what do you anticipate being the most difficult aspect of learning in Bali? For example, that question would then develop into what has been the most difficult aspect of learning so far in the second round of interviews, and so forth. These questions were asked to see how students' perspectives changed over time And at the end of the trip, the interviews were transcribed and coded for themes. The course took place in June through July of 2013 and was conducted in 3 different settings in Bali, Indonesia. The first was at the Indonesia Beach Hotel and Resort in the capital city of Denpasar. For 5 days, participants attended the Bali Arts Festival and observed professional Balinese musicians, dancers, and artists perform. They acclimated their ears to the sounds of Balinese music, their stomachs to Balinese food, and reflected on cultural differences. After 5 days at the festival, participants traveled to the second location at Flower Mountain. The second setting was Flower Mountain, a facility for learning Balinese musical arts near Ubud. That was the former estate of ethnomusicologist Robert E. Brown. In this setting, participants embarked on a rigorous 10-day schedule that began with class discussions around readings about culture, immigration, and school policy, theories on language learning, and ethnography. Then from 10 to noon, participants learned Gamelan Angklung, the same type of ensemble found at our college. We ate lunch from noon to 1. From 1 to 3, we learned Gamelan Gangkebyar, a larger type of gamelan ensemble. And from 3 to 5, we studied Balinese dance. At 5, we ate dinner, and then in the evening, we would do our readings, homework, attend performances, or take excursions to the nearby city of Ubud. By the end of our time at Flower Mountain, we had learned 6 songs and 2 dances in 10 days. The third setting was located in the village of Banjarwani in Karambitan, where Nyoman Swaden lives. Nyoman was Talbot's instructor at the Eastman School of Music, and this was a village where he had lived 2 other summers. Banjarwani is not on the tourist path, and members of the village are less accustomed to running into Westerners. In this setting, we rented the village Gamelan Gangkebyar and followed a schedule of 2-hour gamelan rehearsals in the morning and evening on Gangkebyar only. Our presence was a fascination to our village hosts, and most of the gamelan players from the village joined our rehearsals and played side by side with us. We learned 3 new songs in this setting. However, the learning experience was completely different in that we were playing on a new set of instruments, and each gamelan has a slightly different tuning, and the bars on the instruments are not always organized in the same way. Additionally, instruction was no longer one-directional, but shared. Our new knowledge of how the pieces went from one part of the island often conflicted with the way they are known in this part of the island, and because we experienced side-by-side instruction, we were no longer taught by only one person, but an entire group of people. When we were not rehearsing, we visited and worked in the elementary schools and conducted photo voice and ethnographic projects with adolescents in the village. The trip ended with a culminating performance with nearly 800 people from the surrounding area attending. There were 3 main themes that emerged through the interviews. The first was that of expectations. With all participants, the idea of traveling to a country that does not natively speak English left them with the expectation that there would be a language barrier that would slow down the learning process. However, upon beginning gamelan instruction, participants discovered that their initial expectations were not representative of their actual experiences learning gamelan. This was because they found spoken language was not the main medium of communication, and that instead the teacher relied on gestures, singing the music, and visual and oral cues to explain musical concepts. Although some students occasionally were frustrated by the lack of English and felt they wanted a verbal explanation, one participant said, "I found in this particular context that language was both a huge help and a huge hindrance. As far as rehearsals were concerned, sometimes when things were explained to us, we were even more confused. But then when we actually played it out, and then when we listened to it a few times and started feeling it, that uptake that occurred was probably the most vital learning tool." So even though there was an expectation that verbal explanation would better help them understand, this particular student discovered that the verbal explanations actually confused the meaning and got in the way of understanding the music. The final expectation that emerged through the interviews was when students were asked how they would bring back their new perspectives and apply them to learning in the United States. The majority of participants said they did not think it was possible. Although they acknowledged their perspectives had changed, there was an overwhelming feeling that in order for students to be able to implement those more flexible ideas of time, language, and culture, the entire society would also have to reshape and adopt those cultural views. As students discovered that their expectations did not align with their experiences, they found themselves in situations where they had to make adaptations in their learning. And this theme of adaptations came in the form of both personal adaptations of students as well as teacher accommodations. I started only thinking about my part as an individual, but soon found that this didn't work in this context. I got very frustrated and tried to overthink everything. It worked much better when I stopped thinking about it so much and I could just let go and do it. I definitely look at the things that I'm doing here more holistically than I would in an American setting. All three of these examples show how students began shifting and adapting their learning processes. Initially, they had focused on their individual responsibilities of learning, their part in the music, and separated that from the learning process of the group. After experiencing the group learning involved in Gamelan, students began to view their parts as pieces of the whole and began to focus on the collaborative learning of the ensemble. In Bali, when learning a new song, it is always introduced at the actual tempo of the song, and the learning involves a lot of repetition. Balinese performers know from growing up in this environment how many of these songs go and how the structure of the music is organized. As such, they are able to fill in the gaps as the patterns repeat over and over again. When we began our instruction, our Balinese teachers followed that teaching style because that was what was familiar to them. However, they began noticing that Western students who have learned in different ways soon became frustrated at this approach. Members of the group felt like they were being left behind by the teacher. However, we began noticing that the teacher started to adapt his teaching style in order to accommodate the learning styles of the Western students. As one student noted in an interview, I noticed that the teacher had to make some accommodations for us by slowing the song down for certain sections and going part by part. These examples of adaptations and accommodations show that in the learning environment, both students and teachers are making adaptations in order to create meaning. And through that, everyone in turn is teaching and learning. This focus on group learning and the idea that all members in the environment are both teachers and students was most prevalent in our time in the village of Banjarwani. There we were learning side by side with Balinese villagers and witnessed the emphasis on community and the understanding that everyone has something to contribute and teach in the learning environment. Just by the very virtue of the Balinese village gamelan players being on the instrument adjacent to us, those who were struggling on the trip got to see directly how to do it. It was like being surrounded by teachers everywhere. Whenever you mess up anything, some Balinese man sitting next to you will show you how to do it. These experiences helped students develop the perspective that all students come to a learning environment with different cultural, linguistic, and musical resources that they are drawing off of in order to learn. And through that, everyone has strengths that they can share with the group. As we saw through our interviews, by adjusting expectations through personal adaptations and teacher accommodations, all participants expanded their views to focus on new approaches to learning, new approaches to teaching, and new approaches to musicking. While the majority of participants had the expectation that these new perspectives would not apply in the cultural context of the United States, there were 2 participants who responded optimistically, embracing their new perspectives, and who were eager to implement them in learning environments in the United States. Christina is a junior pre-service music teacher who went on the trip. While in Bali, she spent a significant amount of time learning about the practices behind making offerings in society. Starting as a project for the class, Christina acknowledged that she quickly adopted it as her personal mission to better understand the religious importance of the offerings to the Balinese community. It was a component of the music making that fascinated her, describing it as the most unifying thing between every person on the island. and eventually led to opportunities for Christina to assist Balinese villagers in the process of making offerings. After returning to our gamelan at the college, Christina asked if she would be able to make an offering to our gamelan before a rehearsal. This small act served to change the learning environment and the group's approach to the gamelan, becoming a normal occurrence before every rehearsal. For Christina, making offerings had become a natural part of the process behind playing gamelan. She had embraced the beliefs and practices of the Balinese while in Bali and continued to implement her new views on culture and music upon returning to the United States. Christina reflected on the reasons that compelled her to make offerings when returning to our gamelan. She said, "I wanted to understand the offering's significance. Once I did, it was almost impossible not to come back to Gettysburg and make offerings to the gamelan. Whether or not you practice Hinduism, as the Balinese do, what gamelan is and means to them within that context is overwhelmingly important. I could not come back to our gamelan and not see it as a living thing." Christina's experiences in Bali expanded her views on music and culture and changed her perspective on the learning environment surrounding gamelan. Through creating offerings for the gamelan, Christina was able to create a more inclusive learning environment in which she brought her experience and knowledge of Balinese religious and cultural practices to teach and share with the rest of the group. During her last interview, Christina noted the following: "I think lots of things that we've discovered in Bali have affected our way of thinking during the time we have lived here, and when we go back to the United States, it will feel weird, but I think that weirdness is pointing out the things we need to remember the most. And when you're sitting at home and something happens and you think, why do I feel so weird about this? Why am I missing Bali because of this? It's pointing out something that probably should change, or that you should incorporate into your life, and I think that's how I'm going to try to bring things back with me." This quote shows how Christina's learning evolved and changed over her time in Bali, and how she plans to adapt to her new teaching environments. Her bringing offerings to our gamelan back on campus changed our experience. At the end of the fall semester, Christina performed an offering before our final performance. Everyone in the ensemble, regardless of if they had been to Bali or not, said that this experience just felt different. It was more like Bali. Stephen, another pre-service music teacher in his sophomore year, was a leader in one of the college's a cappella groups. Upon returning to the United States, he found himself in rehearsal settings where he wanted to share his knowledge from his new experiences in Bali and work to transform the a cappella learning environment. In a follow-up interview with Stephen, he explained his intentions for the group and his new views on his role in the group. "I am aware that there are others in the group that are very capable and have good musical ideas that the group can benefit from if shared. Since there are those who know or have knowledge in the group, I don't see the need to be the authoritarian, and I believe that our learning process can include many teachers sharing different ideas. We saw this in Bali when we rehearsed in Banjarwani. Different teachers had different interpretations of how each piece was supposed to sound. They took a good deal of time working it out among themselves and didn't just defer to the person in charge." You can see that Stephen no longer viewed his role in his a cappella group as a director, but rather a facilitator. Drawing from his experiences in Bali, Stephen recognized that everyone in the ensemble comes with different resources and has different strengths, and rather than continuing to make musical decisions for the group and having his peers defer to him as the person in charge, Stephen wanted to recognize those strengths and create the space and support he had felt in Bali in order to allow everyone to be a teacher in the learning environment. So what does this all mean? In Bali, we learned gamelan without any spoken language. The teacher instead used a variety of visual and oral cues, as well as the music itself, to explain musical concepts. Music teachers have a tendency to over-explain musical ideas using English, but music is a language, so we can use it to explain itself. Instead of over-explaining, teachers need to create space for their students to find their own solutions to music problems, and trust that they will find a way. I experienced this as a language learner in Bali. I had a much greater understanding of learning gamelan than perhaps my teachers were initially aware of. So this presents the idea that even though I couldn't always verbally explain a concept, that did not mean I did not understand. The same is true for English language learners as well as all students in our classrooms. For music teacher education, we learned that pre-service music teachers need learning opportunities in which they are placed in an environment where they are an other. This enables pre-service teachers to experience firsthand and greater understand the difficulties that English language learners may face in their future classrooms. Finally, in our cross-cultural society, music teacher education programs need to center educational goals around teaching pre-service music teachers how to be flexible, how to be adaptable, how to reflect, how to critically think, and how to develop new ways of musicking that are culturally relevant and responsive to current students.